You might be a little surprised to see this video coming up because the Speakin' Beacons have, in all honesty, loosened our ties to the homeschooling forensics leagues over the last year or two. I've moved on. I'm no longer the forensics coach at Northwest Christian University. I founded and now directing the honors program, and I have a few other irons in the fire that keep me away from forensics. Last year, we didn't host the West Coast Classic for STOA. It doesn't look like we're going to this year either because there's not a club local for whom it makes sense to help us run it. Although if you know of one, you should get in touch because we would really love to bring that event back. But I got a message from one of our favorite families in all of homeschooling forensics, the Crosby family, and they asked if we would take a look at the topic and offer up some beginning thoughts and maybe some suggested readings. And so we spent a quality couple of hours and just barely scratched the surface. We assumed, given the Crosby's past success in Lincoln-Douglas debate, that referred to the Lincoln-Douglas topic and not the team policy topic. So here are some places to begin for resolved rehabilitation ought to be valued above retribution in criminal justice systems. I'm going to divide this up into some background reading and then into some good-looking readings and some subjects, topic areas for the affirmative, and then the same thing for the negative. Good-looking readings and a couple of issues that you're going to want to account for. Even if they don't make it into your case, you're going to want to know that these issues are out there and you need to be prepared for them. The place I think I would begin in getting an understanding of these issues is with a really good-looking collection of essays called Understanding Justice: An Introduction to Ideas, Perspectives, and Controversies in Modern Penal Theory. What it looks like it does, I haven't sat down and read the whole thing, but I did read some excerpts, and it looks like it takes these ideas historically from where they began and how they evolved through various turns of the controversy. I think that would be a good primer. The second thing I think, I'll put in a plug for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is often very helpful, but never more so than this time. They have an essay on retributive justice that actually explains things quite well and will give you the names of a number of authors who've made pretty coherent arguments. As a matter of fact, I'm going to steal a little bit of their thunder, and in the affirmative and negative readings that I recommend, some of those names came out of the Stanford Encyclopedia essay. Finally, there's an essay that Robert Martinson published in the Public Interest back in 1974, and it was just called What Works? And he reached the conclusion that when it comes to rehabilitation in American corrections, nothing works. And not long after that, the National Academy of Sciences backed up that conclusion, and for quite a while, that was just kind of the received wisdom in corrections in the United States. It's no longer about rehabilitation at all. It is purely about retribution. Now, I'm not saying go back to the 1974 essay, but I am saying that that was such a watershed event in the unfolding of the controversy, in the battle back and forth between rehabilitation and retribution, that a lot of people since then have written review essays, and in particular a lot more recent ones, where they build a pretty hefty case for or against that particular position that Robert Martinson took. In particular, there's one from 2013 by Francis T. Cullen. The title of it is Beyond Nothing Works. So I think if you use Robert Martinson and What Works, or Robert Martinson and Nothing Works, and maybe throw rehabilitation in there as a search term as well, you're going to come across some readings where you will find some really useful little nuggets. That, I think, is a good search term to get you started on both sides of the topic. Now, on the affirmative, what I want to do is I want to recommend 2 books and then an essay. 2 books and then an essay, and then I have a couple of issues that you want to account for, either as part of your affirmative or possibly just things to be ready for that other affirmatives may have going. The first of these books, Martha Nussbaum, who's written extensively about the role of emotion in the criminal justice system, she published a book this year. It is hot off the presses, and the name of the book is Anger and Forgiveness, Resentment, Generosity, Justice. And from the reviews that I've read, I have not in my 2 hours had time to read Nussbaum's book, but from the reviews I've read, I gather that she pretty much just savages retributivism, and a lot of folks who've read the argument that she makes, they find it pretty compelling. They say that she did her usual good work. Another book, this one's a lot older, it's by Jeffrey Murphy and Jean Hampton, Forgiveness and Mercy in 1997, and apparently this is just the extended dance mix of the problems with retributivism, so that's another one to check out. And finally, one that I saw that, it almost has what could be the value of your affirmative case in the title of the article. This is by Amanda Ploch, P-L-O-C-H, and the title of the article is Why Dignity Matters. dignity and the right or not to rehabilitation from international and national perspectives. And if you do a Google search for it, it comes up either on SSRN or possibly on the digital comments for whatever law school law review she published it in. It comes up easily. You don't have to have Lexis access, although if you do, it's there. And she makes the positive case for rehabilitation, not necessarily attacking retributivism, but talking about why rehabilitation itself is important. And, that's a good thing to be able to build into your affirmative. Okay. Couple of ideas for issues that you're going to want to account for. One of them is you'll find plenty written about over-incarceration and about how the United States incarcerates per capita one of the largest segments of its population of any developed nations. We are just absolutely off the charts. And I think on the affirmative, you can go from that to saying, not all these people are in for life without parole. The vast majority are not, which means eventually they are going to cycle back out into the community. And when we incarcerate this many people, you want the heart-stopping number of how many people out of a crowd of 100 are going to be locked up at some point in their lifetimes. And you say, if every single one of these people goes through the institution and the institution is aimed only at just desert and not at all about the transition back into the community after their sentence is served, then we are going to live in increasingly frayed and falling apart communities with people who are still living, trying to live down the trauma of having been in corrections. I think you can take how big that number is, just how sweeping the phenomenon of over-incarceration is. Maybe you do a little spot research about for-profit prisons, and you can even make the argument that so long as this is being driven by a profit motive, this is only going to grow. And then you can say, given our circumstances, rehabilitation is just a matter of self-preservation. Now, a smart negative might have as her value deontological justice and might say that your argument is consequentialist, and if really what we want to do is perfect justice, then the consequences aren't particularly relevant. I think an answer that you could make to that may not be what they expect would be to say, you could be right. You could be right about the judge and the jury, because they are the ones primarily concerned with process, with procedural justice. But when we get to talking about the dilemma between rehabilitation and retribution, we're no longer talking about the courts. We're talking about the third phase of the criminal justice system. If we divide it up into law enforcement as first, courts are second, the third is corrections. And you can say corrections is necessarily consequentialist and pragmatic because it's about the day-to-day supervision and detention of people who have been through a trial. It is necessarily not about procedural justice. So I think you could dismiss that pretty fairly. They could come back and they could say a certain amount of rehabilitation versus retribution still resides with the courts because it's a judge who gets to say, well, I'm going to put you on supervised probation, which pretty clearly is about rehabilitation, and you I'm going to throw the book at, which pretty clearly is about retribution. But I think you have the better half of that argument on the affirmative. Okay, so that's the first issue, over-incarceration. A second issue is I think you could bring up juvenile justice. And you could say that you can't make a blanket claim about a system when an important segment of that system to which we devote a huge slice of the pie of resources absolutely defies the claim. So you could say that the negative does not get to say that justice is retribution when the juvenile justice system is explicitly about rehabilitation. I mean, think about it. The reason we have a juvenile justice system distinct from the adult justice system in the first place is because we think that people who have not yet reached adulthood, juveniles, children, teens, they haven't fully brought all their reasoning skills online. They are therefore not fully culpable. They made stupid, maybe even loathsome and violent mistakes that were hurtful to others, but they were mistakes. And we keep them in the juvenile justice system based on the shared assumption that kids can be redeemed or rehabilitated. You could even bring into it the 2010 Supreme Court decision, Graham versus Florida. That's the one where the court ruled that life without parole for a juvenile was per se cruel and unusual punishment. And that surprised a lot of court watchers because in the majority opinion, they talk at length about rehabilitation. It is incoherent to have a juvenile justice system if it's not about rehabilitation. it surprised a lot of onlookers because they had more or less assumed rehabilitation is dead in American corrections. But the Supreme Court said, we share a belief that if there's going to be a juvenile justice system, it has to be about rehabilitation. So I think you on the affirmative could say that there can't be a sweeping claim that the criminal justice system is about retribution so long as there is a juvenile justice system. Now, there are a couple of easy answers from the negative. The negative can say, first of all, that juveniles incarcerated, that's only about 11% of all crimes, so that's way atypical. The negative could also say every single person who has anything to say about the juvenile justice system says it is kept partitioned off, completely distinct from the rest of the criminal justice system, which means it is the atypical outlier. You can draw no conclusions about it that apply to the system in general. But that's one where you can debate back and forth what are the implications for the larger claim. At the very least, I think the different nature of juvenile justice is just too tempting, and the way it's aligned with rehabilitation, you've got to be able to get some mileage out of that. And if you go up against an opponent who doesn't handle it that effectively, that's an argument that I think has a lot of appeal for judges. I think they'll find it very comfortable to give you mileage on that argument. Okay, over-incarceration, juvenile justice. A third one, I think, sort of a third and a 3.5, because I think these two are closely aligned together, is to talk about mental illness in the first place. And I think you will have absolutely no problem finding a good deal written about how many people who are incarcerated in the United States who are under the supervision of the criminal justice system are mentally ill, because we've let our mental health facilities across the United States so shrink in their capacity that pretty much people who have untreated mental illness, there's nothing for us to do except arrest them for their acting out in public and then warehouse them in jails and prisons. And there I think you can say, where someone is ill, it is not only cruel, it is immoral to refuse to ease their suffering. And punishing someone for the result of illness is indefensible. And I think you could get a lot of good rhetorical mileage out of that. Now, allied with that is the question of substance abuse. There, it gets a little bit more cloudy, because just taking a lot of the controlled substances is itself a crime, and you could get into kind of a murky debate over, well, what is the proper retributive response to someone whose crime is that they were arrested and they had cocaine in their system? And there's an answer to that, and as you read up and do the background reading on how retribution works, you'll find out what that answer is. But you're also going to have to be a little bit careful, especially in defining your terms at the beginning, that you make clear what you mean by rehabilitation. Rehabilitation could mean that someone who is incarcerated or otherwise sanctioned by the criminal justice system, the objective is to try to prevent recidivism, to try to see to it that there are not future offenses. That could be your operational definition of rehabilitation. But the other meaning for it is treatment for substance abuse. I mean, what do you do with someone who's addicted to drugs? You send them to rehab. And what's rehab short for? Rehabilitation. So you're going to want to make sure that nobody gets to get puckish on you and set the debate up as drug rehab versus retribution, because that would be a red-hot mess. Okay, let me talk a little bit about the negative. I think that where you want to begin with the negative, I think you want to take a look at a book by Michael S. Moore, and the title of the book is Placing Blame, A Theory of Criminal Law, and it was published, the second or third edition was published in 2010. The older edition, I think, was published in 1997. But what he does, what he takes on the task of doing, and I think he probably set out as an ambitious philosopher trying to make a clever argument, but he wound up, from the reviews, with a pretty good argument, is a defense of retribution, and why retribution is necessarily the primary function of the criminal justice system. Another published work that does something similar, Susan Dymock, she wrote a paper that ran in the journal Law and Philosophy in 1997 entitled Retributivism and Trust, and she pretty much does the same thing. So if you were to read both of those works, I think you would wind up with some bedrock up defenses of why retributivism is appropriate. And then I have an article that I want to send you off to find that I thought was weird since I first stumbled across it more than 20 years ago when I was working on my doctoral dissertation. You can find my doctoral dissertation online if you ever have absolutely nothing better to do with your time, but it is about the Nuremberg trials. And I found this article by Edward Morgan in the American University Law Review in 1988, and it might be the American University International Law Journal, can't remember. But the title of the article is Retributory Theater. Retributory Theater. And what he does is he talks about the Nuremberg trials, and a lot of people agree that the Nuremberg trials as trials were inappropriate, that they were just victor's justice, that you win the war and then you put your enemies on trial, which is generally regarded as very legally suspect. But he makes the argument that the trials served a very important communicative function, and he grounds that communicative function in retribution. And along the way, he explains retribution in some ways that I would not say are very tightly reasoned, but they're very evocative, and you ought to hear the way he explains it, or read the way, obviously, unless you have an app somewhere that's going to take that PDF and read it out loud. But I would take a look at that if I were you, and I would see how he lays the foundation for his argument in defense of the Nuremberg trials by explaining how they are a form of retribution. You might find some useful moves come out of that. A couple of useful issues that will come up when you're on the negative. I think a really short, easily digested argument you could make would be to say, when you're on the negative, a vote for the affirmative is a vote to abolish the death penalty. If you vote affirmative, what you're saying is that the death penalty has to be abolished, because the death penalty is the utter abandonment of rehabilitation. And the death penalty is about retribution. The death penalty for murder is about taking a life in order to show the value of the life, the innocent life that was taken. That's pure retribution. So if you say that rehabilitation outstrips retribution, then what you're saying is that the death penalty is indefensible. And if you believe that the death penalty has a place, then you can't vote affirmative. Voting affirmative is inconsistent with that belief. And then maybe you provide a short defense. The death penalty is a good idea because. The other argument I think you could make is I think you could say that the way the topic is worded, it says the criminal justice system or systems ought to be more, the wording is it ought to be more about rehabilitation than about retribution. I think you could say that a system has to be about retribution, because rehabilitation it's about mercy. Rehabilitation is about rolling back the consequences, and I think you could make the argument, it would have some appeal to it, that mercy is something that ought to be the prerogative of the victim of the crime. Mercy is not something that a bureaucracy can make a decision to take on for itself. That what bureaucracies ought to do is bureaucracies ought to be about what is the narrowest consensus, what is the most coherent philosophy, organizing philosophy. And I think you could take that premise that an organization has to base what it does, has to base the rules it lays down, especially rules that have precedential value. It has to base them on a coherent philosophy, and things like mercy, like unmerited grace, like rehabilitation after committing a violent crime, that projects like that, acts like that, need to be left up to the individuals who have the choice whether to offer it or whether to withhold it. And I think you could go further to say that those things have no value when they are coerced. They have no value when they are legislated. And I think that that is another move that it can't necessarily make the entire case for you, but it's an interesting move, and I think it's one that a lot of your judges might find appealing. Okay, that is the output of a very quick drive-by on this topic. You can send us messages if you want, and we will give them some thought, and we might come up with some more ideas that you might find useful, but those are at least some places to begin. Hope they turn out to be, hope they get you someplace.